we've been travelling around the country, getting different people's views and opinions on race inequalities. And recently we were in Brixton in London, which has a strong black community. And the people we spoke to on the streets, they were quite resistant to and sceptical of government, and especially the police. How do we bridge the communication gap?
I don't think it's necessarily a communication gap unless you think that it's the messages that aren't getting through. I think it's actually the
But there's got to be a dialogue as well, though. It's not just about message, surely.
That's exactly what I mean. It's not just about communication and messages. It's about the actual experiences of young people, actual experiences of what police does and the government does. By and large, the government doesn't listen to them. And you have tokenistic meetings, and they don't see the results of their arguments and concerns.
So how do you get that across? How do you get them to see that?
I think the first thing that's got to happen is that whenever there are problems with young people, the government keeps doing two things. One, blaming young people and actually enforcing legislation which penalizes and punishes them. You don't do that. If you really want a dialogue, then you've got to ensure that if there are problems, like antisocial behavior, for example, or knife crimes, then you use young people and involve them to create their own solutions for the problem.
How do we ensure that the youth of this country don't remain on the margins and are actually heard?
I think there have to be three concrete steps immediately. I think we have to allocate a massive amount of resources for young people to decide, or have massive amount of resources, youth groups which are cut but they need to be expanded, sports facilities.
But then it all comes down to money and funding. And
but if you're not willing to spend money, then you're not going to get value.
This is true, but then you could possibly have the argument like where there's a finite amount of money to spend. Who do we help? Where does it start?
If you can put 1.3 trillion pounds of money into banks who are responsible for the credit crunch, I think you can spend at least a tenth of that for a generation that will become leaders in the next decade.
So what you're saying is the government needs to change its priorities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think if you want to talk to young people and you think that they have a stake in the future, then you need to put money in it. Secondly, I think more concretely, you've got to create forums where young people actually control the agenda and create the structure of those forums. So they see those places, those spaces, and those forums as something that is generated by themselves and empowers them and actually brings solutions to the problems, and then they're listened to. So I don't think they can be controlled by head teachers and teachers in schools. I don't think they can be controlled by youth workers or local authority officers, in youth group settings. And I don't think government should control the agenda on how young criminals are dealt with. I'm not somebody who advocates that people shouldn't be punished. I think we need to get away from this American model of just, developing legislation after legislation after legislation and just imprisoning people for minor offenses. I mean, if you really look at the situation properly, you'll see the horror of it. At this moment, we, as Britain, have 80 to 82,000 people in prison. That's the second highest in the world. The highest is in America, which has more than 1.2 million. Out of the 80,000 people in male prisons, about 12% are black minority people. In the youth offending institutions, 50% of young prisoners are black or minority. That's a huge disproportionate number of people in
So why do you think that's happening, and how can we combat that?
Because I think there's undoubtedly there's some criminality in it. Apart from that, I think there is, disproportionate discrimination, stereotyping of young blacks and Asians who are on the streets, who don't have resources, who are out on the streets, and our society doesn't tolerate large number of young people on the streets. We see it as a threat, and the reaction is to do something about it. And sometimes all we think about is, they can do music or sports. Those are the kind of stereotyping, policies and resources that are thrown to them. So I think self-organization is critical. Self-ownership is absolutely critical. And I think the third thing is that when we talk about young people, there are different people who are young don't think in one way. It's not a homogeneous group, it's a heterogeneous group. Nobody leads it. And I think we need to make sure that both young boys and girls, for example, are listened to and properly, and we look at the priorities they set with the needs that they develop, and they're met in the way that different sectors of young people set the agenda.
How optimistic are you about the future?
I'm very optimistic about the future because I think there are massive amount of, for many reasons. The first is that I think that we can overcome obstacles which are set against us. When I was growing up, I couldn't even go to a local authority and argue my case. I was inevitably thrown by a councillor out of the town hall because they didn't see us as groups of individuals who had a say in this country. We can influence politicians in how they think. We can make political representations and use the political process to develop campaigns for reforms. We have an economic power which can be used to extend notions of rights. And we are not, and I don't think we should ever think of black people who have no stake in the future and the rest of the population doesn't have a stake in our future. We need to think of ourselves as part of British society if we want to have a mindset to change. We are not the older generation who didn't want to settle here but actually ended up settling here because they couldn't go back. We are going to die in this country, and our children are going to live and die in this country, and our grandchildren are going to die in this country. So we have a physical stake in this, the future of this country. But I think for a population that's only 6 to 8%, we've raised the debate of discrimination nationally. We are very visible for, our social force is much greater than the size of the population. We have made a massive impact in popular culture, in sports, in music, in politics, that the gains we've made over the last 30, 40 years since we've come are so enormous they can never be rolled back. We can only go forward, okay? And the problem is, do our children or do the young people think we have a stake in the future? It's a serious issue. But I think that can only be resolved if people like me say, well, we're not doing this for the future, we want changes now. So we don't wait for 20 years, we actually begin to make those changes.
Implement them now,
Implement them now. And I think we need to make sure that there is a constant monitoring, constant review, constant challenges, and constant empowering of people, both black and white. See, one thing that's happened is, although we fought against racism, the recipients of the success and the fruits of our labor, not just black people, everybody has
benefits the whole community.
It's benefited the whole community. So people see the dynamic of becoming more multicultural and more integrated, but in a sense which leads us more forward into a more inclusive society. And finally, I think the only danger that we have is if we withdraw and become individual identities, or we are shaped by our religion, we only see through things through our culture or identities. I think that's a retrogressive stuff. I think we need to show that we have a program which benefits culturally, politically, socially, and economically in a very comprehensive way. If we just use notions of cultural politics, then I think we will create little islands which has no notions of stake in the future of this country.
Suresh Grover, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for talking to me.
Stay in the loop. www.be-united.org